This episode is brought to you by Iams Pet Food. When you choose Iams dry dog or cat food, you can see a difference in your pet with your own eyes. Healthy energy in 5 days, healthy digestion in 10 days, and healthy skin and coat in just 25 days. Satisfaction for you and them. Guaranteed or your money back. Feed Iams dry dog or cat food and see a visible difference. Visit iams.com/difference to learn more.
The Sephora Savings Event is here.
World in my hand, I'll take this and that.
And that. Ooh, and this. Oh, it's true. Find everything you want on sale at the Sephora Savings Event. It only happens twice a year, and it's on now through November 11th. Find brands like Rare Beauty, Glow Recipe, Valentino, K18, and more, all for less. Shop at Sephora and Sephora at Kohl's today. Limitations apply. Must be a beauty insider. See terms at Sephora.com for complete details.
Welcome back to the Philosophemes podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Scalumbrino. I'm proud to be part of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Thank you for being here. This episode may get a little heavy in the beginning, but hang in there because everything in this episode is actually straightforward once you orient to the vocabulary. And be sure to stick around till the end because I built some unique and fun stuff into this episode. I'm going to say some things in this episode about people experiencing different forms of mental illness. And I just want to be clear that I respect everyone I have ever treated as a patient, and I am in no way disparaging individuals experiencing different forms of mental illness. I have devoted many years of my life to helping people with mental illness, so as I pursue the goal of keeping this episode entertaining, light, and friendly, please do not construe anything I say as disparaging anyone. We're not doing cultural politics or religion here. We're doing philosophy. And everyone is welcome here on the Philosophemes podcast. On the difference between nihilism and absurdism. Let's jump in. Wikipedia's definition of absurdism is wrong. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, a few comments to set the stage here, so to speak, to establish the context will be helpful. So let's take a quick look at how absurdism relates to postmodernism and how postmodernism relates to transhumanism and posthumanism. We can do this very briefly, then I'll get into the difference between absurdism and nihilism. Absurdism is a very popular topic nowadays. Absurdism has always been around, but it is an especially prominent topic in the context of postmodernism. Though there are many ways to characterize postmodernism, and I have a YouTube video titled "What is Postmodernism?" if you'd like to take a deeper dive into postmodernism. One of the ways we can understand postmodernism is in terms of a distinction that became popular during the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011, the distinction between the 1% and the 99%. The reason this is important is that as humans get closer to being the 1%, they need to participate less and less with the types of daily activities that humans are otherwise required to participate in order to survive. This idea is straightforward and intuitive. On the one hand, the closer you get to being the 1%, the less time and energy you need to expend working to pay bills or feed yourself. It's, of course, also true that the money gains you access to all sorts of technologies and chemicals that allow for you to shape your life in accordance with the limits of the technological and chemical interventions. On the other hand, the further you are away from the 1%, the more you can only shape your life in accordance with the limits of your humanity. In other words, the limits of your own effort or the charity of others. In an increasingly technologically mediated existence, living in accordance with the limits of humanity can induce a fear of missing out. This is FOMO, F-O-M-O, that is associated with POMO, P-O-M-O, which is the abbreviation for postmodernism. Lastly, notice that there are other ways to characterize postmodernism, but in regard to this characterization, it's helpful to recognize that being closer to the 1% means more potential to actualize a transhuman or post-human life. The logical structure to the relationships here are rock solid, but people tend to not consider how postmodernism relates to transhumanism and posthumanism. So it's helpful to remind ourselves as we approach the question of the difference between nihilism and absurdism. All right, here we go. The 4 positions in relation to a question. Now, when you first see this, it's a little strange, but you'll immediately recognize that it's true. So notice that if I were to ask you a question, then in general, there are only 4 possible ways that you could respond to me. Let me phrase that a little more technically. There are only 4 categories of possible responses. This works for both closed yes or no questions and open questions, but it takes less time to show for closed questions, so we'll use a closed question. Let's take, for example, then, the question, does life have inherent meaning? That is, meaning beyond whatever subjective meaning we give it. The 4 categories of possible responses would be 1, yes, 2, no, 3, I don't know or maybe, and 4, something non sequitur like squirrel. Now, to say no is to affirm a nihilistic position regarding existence, and to say squirrel is to affirm an absurdist position regarding existence. This is key and very important if we want to understand the difference between nihilism and absurdism. All right. According to Wikipedia, quote, absurdism is a philosophical theory that the universe is meaningless and irrational, end quote. So why is that wrong? Because it's the definition of ontological and criteriological nihilism. It's not the definition of absurdism. Let's get into it. I already put together a video for YouTube on nihilism, but maybe down the road I'll do a podcast episode on nihilism too. For our purposes here, though, we can note, recalling the architectonic of philosophy that I mentioned in the tier list podcast episode and tier list YouTube video, we can differentiate between ontological nihilism, criteriological nihilism, and soteriological nihilism. The first is ontological because it says no regarding being. In other words, existence and the universe are meaningless. The second is criteriological. Recall, criteriology includes methodology and epistemology. And therefore, the second is criteriological because it believes that there are no criteria we can use to gain knowledge of existence and the universe. In other words, if existence is irrational, then we cannot use reason to get a knowledge grip on existence. Third, though Wikipedia doesn't mention it explicitly, is, of course, soteriological nihilism, which means there is no way to save yourself, or there is no value to existence. This may be implicit in the statement that existence is meaningless, but if someone were arguing that philosophical position against us and said meaninglessness includes valuelessness, I'd argue with them about that. All right. So in sum, we can identify ontological, criteriological, and soteriological nihilism. However, as we will see, absurdism divides into ontological and performative absurdism. Why can't we identify the same structure for absurdism as we just identified for nihilism? Because when you say that existence is absurd, it points to a context that includes your statement that existence is absurd. This has been in the mainstream of philosophy since at least Derrida's writings, though technically this insight can be found in ancient Greek philosophy as well. It's often called the problem of self-reference. Think of it like this. If I say, in English, mind you, that the English language is meaningless, then if that statement is true, then that statement shouldn't mean anything to you. So if you take that statement and then use it as a premise from which to draw a rational conclusion, you're being a criteriological nihilist, not an absurdist. You're saying no to the English language, but the absurdist, in order to be an absurdist, should say squirrel to the English language. This is how you can tell what in psychiatry is called malingering from real psychosis. A psychotic person doesn't coherently answer your questions. A psychotic person doesn't string together a coherent narrative to explain to you that they are psychotic. Back in Ohio for a time, I was a forensic monitor of one of the districts in Ohio, which meant that I was tasked with visiting and keeping tabs on everyone living in my district who had been deemed not guilty by reason of insanity. And at my last mental health job here in Colorado, I worked as a registered psychotherapist, and my title was lead psychotherapist on the adult psychosis unit. The nurses and the techs had given me the nickname of the psychotics whisperer, but we'll save those stories for a different episode. I'm only stating this here for two reasons. One, I know what I'm talking about. And two, psychosis is a perfect example of absurdism because it really is a performance, albeit involuntary in true psychosis, of the philosophical position of absurdism. This is not to say it is all chuckles and giggles, because in fact, it is quite dangerous and unpredictable to be on a locked psychiatric ward with, for example, the criminally insane and the psychotically deranged. I never let anyone stand behind me. Many tried, and I've seen more people assaulted than I care to remember, but I'd like to keep the vibe light here, so we'll revisit the psych ward in future episodes. I recall one of my former academic colleagues calling me on the phone and asking, "Dr. Scalumbrino, is it true that you work at an insane asylum?" And I said, "Yes, that is true." My coworkers at the hospital got a good laugh out of that one. All right, so what is the point here? The point is that every one of us is a part of existence. So it is absurd indeed to believe that in a meaningless universe, in a meaningless existence, we can arrive at the meaningful conclusion that existence is meaningless. This is why the English translation of the beginning of Ecclesiastes should be vanity, 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 all is vanity, and not meaningless, 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 all is meaningless. Because if all is meaningless, then so is the statement that all is meaningless. It's the philosophical problem of self-reference, the most infamous example of which is the liar paradox. If a person says they are lying, then if they are lying, notice the self-reference, if they are lying, then they are telling the truth because they said they are lying. But if they are telling the truth, then they are lying because they said they are lying. Therefore, if people want to believe in ontological absurdism, then performative absurdism immediately follows. You do not pass go. You do not collect 24 turkeys on the way to the donut shop. Nihilism still believes in the value of saying no. Nihilism still believes in the value of being rational. Nihilism still believes in the value of being serious. Nihilism still believes in the value of organized thinking. So to say no to meaningful existence is really to say no in a qualified way, which is why nihilism itself is not a good philosophy. But if you want to say no in an unqualified way by suggesting that even your saying no is meaningless, then your no is not the usual saying no. Your no is a performance of absurdity. In fact, it may be going too far to say there can be ontological absurdism because real absurdism seems incapable of performing beyond logical absurdities. A family once brought one of their family members who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia to see me while I was working as a mental health administrator because they had heard I might be able to help them. This was the 90s, so please excuse the use of the word Indian in an upcoming quote. During my first contact with their family member, diagnosed with schizophrenia, I asked the person to tell me what they intended to do in the future. And they, with the kind of cadence and bass that one might expect from a coffee shop bartender in Amsterdam, "I want to be an Indian chief." I then asked them, "What do you have to do to become an Indian chief?" I wasn't just attempting to go to the person's context of understanding, nor was I just attempting to actively listen, nor was I just attempting to make psychological contact with them. Rather, I was extending the opportunity for the person to be coherent with me, extending the opportunity for the person to be rational with me. There was a strange pause, and the person started speaking in a much more coherent way to me. The family was astonished. I think that they probably just would immediately say, "Why are you talking like that?" whenever this person would say those types of things at home. But their astonishment interfered to such an extent that I couldn't hold the momentary gestalt contact with the person. And our conversation faded into formalities and the family's hope for future interactions. However, I was not practicing psychotherapy at the time. I was working as an administrator, so I was not able to continue extending hospitality to the person. It was actually a rule. The level of administration that I was working at made it such that I was not allowed to see patients in that area of Ohio. Certainly, not all interactions go that way. On my first day of working, I'm choosing my words carefully here. On my first day of working at a psychiatric ward, I was told that even though I had plenty of experience and knew how to do the job, I was supposed to shadow a therapist for 2 weeks. Now, this was day one, mind you. After group therapy ended, the therapist pointed out to me the individual with whom we were supposed to be having what's called a family meeting with later. The therapist then approached this individual, who was not only a not so long ago user of steroids, but over 6 foot tall and jacked with muscle. The therapist asked the patient if the patient would like to sign paperwork so that the therapist could speak with a specific family member. And hearing this was so, should we say, triggering to the individual that they began screaming. They became red-faced, their veins bulging, their tone growling, and they screamed, "No." What kind of no was that? The scene was so intense and so intimidating that I could feel myself exerting energy to mask any involuntary expressions of fear that were triggered in me. I mean, hopefully, had it gone down, I would have been able to escape the room without anyone being harmed. These are patients, and we are therapists, of course. But chances were someone was going to be physically hurt in the process. And in regard to that idea, especially in that context, every fiber of my being was saying no. What kind of no was that? I then said to the therapist I was shadowing, "Look, we can't take this guy off the unit to have a family meeting. It's not safe." The therapist then reassured me that it was a common practice, and administration would be angry if we weren't able to bill for a family meeting. Having worked in administration, I found that hard to believe because it's ridiculous to have your employees operating with more risk than is absolutely necessary. Moreover, it is not clinically beneficial to the patient or the family member if the patient is too unstable and disorganized for either of them to benefit from the family meeting. Not to mention just it's straight up dangerous. But this was my first day. So I figured the therapist had good reason for her decision, and I hadn't met any of the administrators whom she was alleging didn't care about employee safety, so I just kept on shadowing her. About 30 minutes later, we took the patient off of the locked unit and walked them to the family meeting room. After their family member joined us, about 3 sentences into the conversation, the patient went completely berserk. He picked up a chair in this small room and, smashing it into the wall, he put holes in the drywall. And this was before throwing the chair at his family member, missing them, thankfully, but putting more holes in the wall. Because he attacked the wall first was probably the only reason no one actually got hurt, because everyone scattered and ran out of the room. We then had to figure out a way to calm him down and convince him to go back into the locked unit, because where he was located presently, he had access and opportunity to attack other staff members and so on. If someone asks you whether you wash your own clothes at home, and you respond by performing a rampage, the first description to come to mind wouldn't be that you are a nihilist, though I would and do consider such behavior to be absurd. The word absurd sounds so friendly, but it definitely can also be dangerous. André Breton, who wrote the Surrealist Manifesto, Surrealism, of course, is a philosophy of absurdism, said that the highest artistic act is to kill a random stranger. In other words, killing some random person for no real reason whatsoever. That's the surrealist characterization of the height of artistic absurdity. So the term absurd isn't necessarily friendly. Heath Ledger nailed it with the question, why so serious? To paint yourself up like a clown and go on a murderous rampage only in psychopathological fashion to ask the mourners afterward,
Why so serious?
Oh, that's the right way to understand absurdism.
Why so serious?
The criteria used by nihilists is rational. The criteria used by absurdists is pathological or fashionable, whereas nihilists still seek to use criteria that are reality-based, right? They are trying to get reality right by saying no. The absurdist isn't trying to get reality right, because to be an absurdist is to act as if there is no such thing as getting reality right. Thus, absurdism is a performance, and performative absurdism does not orient to external reality with a meaning-making that seeks to be reality-based. Let's briefly consider the philosophical genealogy at work here. Absurdism, it seems to me, is ultimately the French contribution to philosophy. French thinkers, since at least Descartes, have kept alive the possibility of embracing incoherency. And let me remind you that Sigmund Freud is a Cartesian. It, of course, reaches a height with surrealism, which is ultimately French. And despite the philosophical magnificence of Gilles Deleuze, who I consider the greatest French philosopher to have ever lived, ultimately he and, I don't get overly bent on how to pronounce these guys, how to pronounce their names, right? When I was living in Paris, it was a thing, but I'm not concerned to pronounce their names correctly. So however you pronounce this fella's name, it's like, I used to say all the time, it's like, in order to pronounce these names correctly, you have to behave absurdly, right? So there's Gilles Deleuze. I got that one pretty good. But then there's Félix Guattari. It's like saying Jacques Lacan. Deleuze and Guattari fell back into this French celebration of chaos with their endorsement of schizophrenia as a philosophy. Sartre, Camus, and de Beauvoir are no exception to this either. In fact, this much celebrated idea on social media that, quote, we must imagine Sisyphus happy, end quote, from Camus, is an absurdist idea. So just to make sure we're clear here, it seems to me that absurdism is ultimately the French contribution to philosophy. So if it is obvious that Sisyphus is unhappy, then let's be absurd so that we can consider Sisyphus happy. But that's not just a mistaken understanding of happiness, it's also a misunderstanding of absurdism. When someone says Sisyphus is unhappy, the absurdist should say, squirrel. By the time I was a graduate student in philosophy, I had already clocked many hours in many roles in the world of treating mental health. So one day, a conversation started up during class about capitalism and schizophrenia, which, of course, is a Deleuze-related conversation. One of the students, whom I think it is relevant to note, this student was often referred to by other students as a trustafarian, which, so I assume that meant that this person had a trust fund. I didn't know the person very well, but supposedly they'd never worked a job in their life, other than when they once took a job as a barista for the sake of meeting people to go out drinking with. 1%. Ish. Now, This person's contribution to the class discussion was to say that the only way employment practices in America would be fair is if we, and this is pretty much verbatim what they said, is if we allowed the capitalists to use the factory half of the time and the schizophrenics to use the factory the other half of the time. I immediately raised my hand and asked the individual if they had ever met someone diagnosed with schizophrenia, and they said no, they had not. Personally, I think Gilles Deleuze is the greatest French philosopher of all time. I really do. Not the greatest philosopher of all time, but the greatest French philosopher. But his discussions of schizophrenia are truly absurd. It's evidently fashionable to watch someone suffer from delusions and hallucinate uncontrollably in the absence of drugs and consider them the truly free person, like a kind of noble savage. But if you ever truly spent time with people who are psychotic, then you'll realize pretty quickly that it's not a party and it's not something to celebrate. It's a serious condition.
Why so serious?
How does nihilism relate to existentialism? Nihilism tends to hang around existentialism because nihilism can be an existential philosophy, but even more so because existentialism is an antidote for nihilism. If we think of the German Romantics who gave birth to existentialism and the other German existentialists, then we see that absurdism is far from anything they would endorse. The only wild card among them, and it would be helpful to list the names of the philosophers I'm talking about right now, so here's the list: Schelling, Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Heidegger. The only wild card in that list is Nietzsche. There are places where it may seem like Nietzsche would be okay with absurdism or endorse absurdism. But ultimately, I think that's a mistake that stems from Nietzsche's complicated, aphoristic, epigrammatic, and highly artistic style of writing. Absurdism embraces chaos, but not in a rational, let's philosophize about it way. All right, let's wrap this up now. Okay, so there are a number of philosophies that are self-defeating. My favorite way to refer to them is that they collapse under their own weight. In other words, the very criteria that characterize them thereby indicate they are not viable philosophies. There are actually many of them, but the easiest to see, in my opinion, is the philosophical argument for solipsism. So solipsism is the belief popularized by the French philosopher Descartes, and which, this should not be a surprise to us. Solipsism is the belief that the person who believes it is the only person who exists. When people first read Descartes, they start running around saying one of two things. They tend to express the skeptical idea that existence is just a dream. And they tend to express the solipsistic idea that maybe they are the only person who exists. This, of course, is an idea raised by what's called the problem of other minds in Descartes' meditations. But notice that solipsism collapses under its own weight. If you believe you are the only person who exists, then who are you talking to? Who are you trying to convince that you are the only person who exists? It's different from the liar paradox, because if you think you're telling someone else that you're the only person who exists, then you're obviously wrong. Solipsism collapses under its own weight. If you attempt to treat absurdism like a coherent philosophy, then it collapses under its own weight. You can't pretend The only meaningful statements are the ones you make when you are stating that all the other statements ever made or that ever will be made are meaningless. Absurdism is performative, or it is nihilism.
Well, you don't see that every day.
Raccoons dancing in the forest. Order ice cream from my mobile phone. All that is gone. They're coming to get you. All that's to come. Dark side and everything under the sun. Really. So stop over to YouTube and let me know if you're a solipsist. I hope you now have a better idea of the difference between nihilism and squirrel.